Hey there, gang. Patrick King here, and I want to thank you for tuning in for episode number 28 of Talking About Horses. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by horseman, and most specifically, Classical California Bridle Horseman, Bruce Sandifer. Bruce, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, well, it's great to be here, Patrick. Thanks for having me.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you. I've been looking forward to connecting with you for several years now, actually. We've kind of crossed some paths through social media, and it's always been great to see the posts and listen to what you've got going on. For the folks out here listening that maybe don't know who you are or aren't familiar with you and what you do, can you give us a little bit of your background, your biography? How'd you get your start with horses?
Well, I started out as a ranch cowboy, and I did that for about 25 years, big outfit ranch cowboy, buckaroo all over the country, from Canada to Texas, basically. Working on different ranches, mostly big outfits, and, from there, I went on to starting a lot of colts, in the performance horse industry, mainly rein cow horses and reiners, and showing a little bit. And when I came back down to California, I got really deep into the traditional California bridle horse thing, and that's what kind of set me on this path here for the last 15 years or so.
Wow. Okay, so talk to me maybe about the what is this path? We talk about the Classical Californio Bridle Horse. What does that mean? What is that?
Well, for us, it is, the Spanish California type from the end of the mission period through the Rancho period. And basically, these are horses that are started in a hackamore and then brought into a two-rein, which is a small hackamore and a bridle, and then ending up straight up in a bridle. And bridle horse in this, or in my opinion, in this style, is a spade bit horse. And, the horses are started at 4 years old. They never have a bit in their mouth until the teeth are fully set. A lot of the modern ray cow horse, more modern California style is snaffle bit, hackamore, two-rein, bridle. We don't do the snaffle bit section.
Mm-hmm.
We start our horses a little bit older, and a little bit more early California traditional. And one of the reasons for that is that's the way I grew up, starting them in the snaffle and going to a hackamore and then the two-rein, and after a while it became I didn't see the point of the snaffle bit process unless you're starting 2-year-olds. Because a hackamore horse won't ride, you can't ride it for 3 years in a hackamore and have a very responsive horse by the time you go into the two-rein. And so I think that was one of the reasons for the snaffle bit addition, plus the futurity aspect of most people showing in young horses and futurity things, and we don't do that.
Right.
We have an association where we do show a little bit, but nothing can be shown until it's 4 years old, and it's just hackamore, two-rein bridle.
Okay. So you said, did I hear you right? You said you really can't ride a horse in a hackamore for 3 years and keep him light for in the two-rein?
Well, I don't think they're going to be, when you want to switch into a two-rein on your hackamore horse, mm-hmm. is when that horse is at the peak of its performance. And so once you go, you can keep them fairly light for 3 years. I mean, but you have to be real careful. But if you're working a lot of cattle and stuff, they're going to figure out that it's just a piece of leather on their nose.
Ah, just a bluff, yeah.
Yeah, and it's, people say it's a bluff, but really, in the traditional system, it's more of a balance point. And so,
okay.
The hackamore is the most important stage, in my opinion, in that, we start our horses in a pretty soft hackamore, because that's the time when you might be pulling on them. You know, horses are going to spook and they're going to do colt things. And, but we teach them where to put their feet, how to use their feet with a human on their back, how to start collecting and using the hind end. This is very, you know, horses really have to work through their hocks in this style, because it is a cow horse style. We do a lot of roping and a lot of cow work. And so all of that's done in the hackamore. The horse is basically fully trained in the hackamore. He'll learn to work off the balance of your seat and the change of balance in the hackamore, and he can get really light. What happens is, you know, with speed and roping and stuff, the horse will kind of learn that he can push into the hackamore. And so riding one for 3-4 years in one, they're going to figure that out.
So there's just more room for error on the rider's part at that point, is what you mean?
I think so.
Okay.
You know, it just depends on what you're doing, and I think, you know, it's like everything. It's your specific situation. You know, we use our horses. We gather cattle in pretty rough country and stuff. So I've found that it's hard for me to keep one really at that. When I want to go into the 2 rein is when that horse is really, really at its lightest, at its finest point. I don't want to go to the bridle because the hackamore quit working.
Yeah.
So to speak. You know, and so that's just, you know, my take on it. I'm sure people out there that are doing things can get that done. But for me, besides that, I like to be in the hackamore about a year and a half, and then go into that bridle as that horse's mouth is fully set. So he's not teething at all. His mouth is set. And so I don't like to put anything in their mouth until their mouth is set. So if I start them at 4 and I go a year and a half, that kind of puts me in that right range there for going into a bridle. Gotcha.
Okay. I've heard a line. I don't even recall where I've heard it, but I've heard it, I think, several times, that a lot of old bridle horse fellas wouldn't put a bit in the horse's mouth until what they referred to as the horse's chest popped. And the way that I understand that is that the horse has, as you talked about, kind of started collecting, learned to use his haunches, and he's starting to elevate then in the thoracic sling,
right,
which is giving him better development and opportunity for mobility and movement and a more uphill carriage. Is that kind of how you think about it?
Absolutely. And that's a big, important part that I think the traditional California system is a little bit different, is that we are really collection driven. You know, a lot of Western horses, they don't really collect up that much. Mm-hmm. But these type of horses, more of a classical background. The Spanish California, you know, they were all classically trained either in the military or the parishes. And so there's a lot more of that. We like to see our horses upright. And it's a balance system. Everything has a strong neutral position and works on a balance. And change of balance is a signal. Return to balance is the reward. And so if a horse isn't elevated enough, he's not going to carry that bridle in a position where it can balance, the balance can work. If that makes any sense. Okay. He has to have that elevation in his neck and arch and that uphill carriage.
Okay. Now, you touched on a point that I'm really glad that you mentioned, and that was about a lot of Western horses not necessarily collecting up, so to speak. When you're talking about collection, can you tell me what you're looking for? How would you define collection?
Well, for me, you know, it's the horse is engaging the underside and stretching the top line of his body, and so that he's reaching further with his hind legs, and he's putting more weight. He's carrying more weight on his hind. We're very big into a horse actually driving from behind and working from behind, where many horses now kind of work off their front ends And like cutting horses, and specifically, you know, a lot of the cow horses, they push off that front, you know.
Moving sort of like a wedge, yeah?
What's that?
They kind of sweep back and forth, but they move sort of like a wedge, very downhill.
Yeah, they're down and they're pushing off with that front end. Well, that's fine if you're in the sand, but on real grass conditions and stuff, those horses will fall down.
Yeah.
You know, on steep hills and stuff like that. So we need a horse that works off its hind end and lifts its front legs and rotates around. You know, they're going to push off, but they don't have that low sweep in the front end.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And we do a lot of roping too. So, you know, if a horse goes down like that when it's working a cow and you rope something, the saddle slides up front. It's just a different type of horse.
Right.
You know, It's gotten very specialized, a lot of Western riding, where this system is, the horse needs to do everything pretty well. Needs to travel around the country good. He needs to be able to rope and work a cow, and work 100 cows, not just one.
Yeah, gotcha. So would you say that you'd be able to use or not maybe one of those sort of modern specialized horses for the rein cow horse or the reining or the cutting that are kind of built like that downhill wedge? Is that a horse that we would say maybe would not be suitable for this type of riding?
No, those learn. You know, I've done a lot of quarter horses and a lot of different. We ride, you know, generally in my workshops, I ride a couple of 300 to 400 horses a year, and they're all kind of fine. And every horse can collect up, and you know, I think some horses are just more naturally built that way. The Spanish horses, I tend to favor the Spanish horses because basically they've got a bridle horse build, and so you don't have to reinvent the wheel to get it, so to speak. You know, they're kind of set up that way. Right.
Yeah, a lot of those those Spanish bred, Spanish type horses kind of come out of the womb collected.
Yeah, I mean, they're born for balance. And so, you know, and they're real uncomfortable if they're out of balance. And so the system seems to work very well, you know, but I've done a lot of quarter horses and stuff like that. It's just that I feel it takes a little more time to develop the collection. You really have to do, you know.
Uh-oh, are you there? Can you hear me? Uh-oh, we seem to have lost him. Uh-oh. We'll call him back. Gosh, I hate when that happens.
Lost you there.
Yeah, lost you. Sorry about that. I hate when that happens.
Yeah. So I don't know where I was at.
So we were talking about it takes a little bit more time with the quarter horses that you see in your workshops to kind of get them.
Horses are generally built, whether they be quarter horses or whatever, that is built a little downhill. You know, tend to be downhill. It takes a lot more time to build that collection up. You know, it's kind of specific to that horse. You know, and it has to be built just like any other form of collection. You know, classical collections built through lateral movements and things like that. You know, exercises. And I don't think, you know, that's one thing that I think a lot of cowboy horses are missing. You know, when you just go out and trot big miles, you don't really spend a lot of time gathering the horse up.
Yeah, gotcha. Absolutely. So you talk a lot, Bruce, about balance and about how this kind of horsemanship comes from a place of balance. And you mentioned the balance is the reward when the horse gets back into the balance if they've lost it or when they come to it in the first place. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What are you meaning when you talk about balance?
Well, each piece of equipment in this system has a point where it hangs in balance, and there's like a sweet spot. And if the horse carries itself in this place, nothing hits it. It just hangs off the headstall. the bridle or the hackamore. We use a feeder on ours, and it balances that spot. And when they put their head in that spot, nothing touches them, basically. And what we try to do is incorporate that same thing in our seat. We have a point in the center of our seat where we're not behind or ahead of the movement. We're in the center of the movement as close as we can. When we adjust that balance by sitting down or lifting up, it changes that balance. The horse will find that, and we return to that neutral position, what we call the neutral position, and the horse is rewarded. And so instead of a horse trying to get away from you, like from a spur or from pressure, the horse follows the feel that you give it, opening a door somewhere, and then returning to neutral is the reward for that. So they're kind of always searching for your center. And we like to say we ride them through their spine to our spine. And so everything is done, so that we can ride them with one hand and be very effective and yet not lose all your lateral flexion in the process.
Okay. So we might in the dressage world talk then about that horse being between the aids or on the aids.
Yeah, I mean...
Or maybe with the aids, I think maybe would be... I prefer to use the term with the aids rather than on.
And that would be, like say from a dressage standpoint, you would ride in a light contact, right?
Yes.
Right? So they're supposed to be on the bit. And the bits in the California system, our very good Spade bit, is built with that same balance point so that the weight of the bit and the weight of the range creates a light contact. But it's not it's an indirect light contact. It's not something you have to hold in your hand. If that makes any sense. It's created through a mechanical force. And what that does is allows you to be a lot, instead of having to have that horse gathered all the time, you can just gather him when he needs to work and then let him go because you ride maybe 10, 11 hours of the day or you're riding a lot of country. So that horse needs to be able to relax in between those gathered moments.
Gotcha. Okay. So then you talked about the weight and the balance creating the contact, and sort of what comes to mind for me is maybe a rock on a string, or even sort of maybe a yo-yo, where you can work that because of the line and because of the way that it's working, the contact has remained without hanging on it or holding on to it necessarily.
Right. Yeah, you don't have to engage it with your hand to have that balance work. But the equipment, it's always seeking that balance point itself. And so it's always telling that horse, and that's why it takes a little bit longer to bit a horse in a Spade bit. And that's why we use the two-rein process. He knows how to balance and find the balance of the hackamore. So we use the two-rein. And sometimes for a couple of years, we use them. And, we'll start for several months and never touch the bridle reins. We just show them where the balance point of that bit is. And then when we change the balance in the hackamore, the two-rein hackamore, it'll change the balance in that bit, and they'll start to understand that going from around the nose to in the mouth. And one of the things that people ask me all the time, well, if the horse is so good in the hackamore, why do you go to a bit?
Mm-hmm.
And the bit is not to create a bunch of force. All it is it's like an amplifier of the signal. So I can use a smaller signal, move my hand way less, and still get the same amount of signal through the bridle. And it also has, a little bit of enforcement to it because it is a curb bit. It's one that's very, very slow to engage the pressure from the curb strap or the pressure on the bar of the mouth. So there's a ton of signal to it, but it's there. And it's kind of like a cop being by the side of the road. If he's parked there, you're going to slow down. And so the horse starts to understand that, just having that in his mouth will kind of tell him, pay attention, don't push into things. So that's the reason we go into a bridle. Plus, you can use a lot smaller movement. When you get to roping, we pack 60 foot of rope, and there's one thing to be very, if you're in an arena and you're riding around on good ground and you have the ability to ride very correctly, that's all great. But when you've got, 60 foot of rope and maybe a wild cow rope and you're on a side hill, that horse needs to be able to protect himself. And so the spade bit is actually designed so the horse can take a hold of it and protect himself when you can't.
How do you mean protect himself?
Well, with the braces, the way they are, he can stop the rotation of the bit. The bit doesn't engage any pressure until it rotates enough for the curb strap to engage and the bar, the cannon bar to come in contact with his bars. Mm-hmm. So what he'll do is because of the height of the spoon and the braces, it gives a wider point there. He can use his lips and his mouth to hold that bit from rotating. And so the whole system is built to protect the horse's mouth, every aspect of it, from the hack-a-mole training up into the spade bit. And that's where people have a big misconception, because the spade bit's kind of a big bit, mm-hmm. and they just don't understand the mechanics of it. There are things that you can't do. You can't split your reins in a spade bit and pull out to the side.
Right.
Because the mouthpiece sticks up into, just past the first premolar, actually. It's not very high in a horse's mouth. There's about 8 inches above that before you get to their back molars. Mm-hmm. So it just, but if you grab it by one hand and pull out to the side, you're going to tip that in there and possibly nick a gum.
Oh, yeah.
Because it is in between the two sets of teeth. Mm-hmm. But that straight on, it's way less severe than most, even pelhams that you have that have the same amount of leverage, because it just has so much more surface to distribute any pressure that is applied.
Gotcha. So it's a surface area game.
Yeah.
Similar to, like, if we were, I don't know, when I do bitting lectures, I have a spade bit that I carry around, and people always get the, oh gosh, that's awful, and I have them do a little exercise where they'll just push one finger on their thigh versus pushing 4 fingers on their thigh, and they realize that the greater surface area is actually easier to bear in that sense.
Yeah, I just, you whip out your knife and say, which end do you want to cut, the thick one or the skinny one, I mean, yeah. It's the same thing, the pressure applied over a smaller area is going to create more pain than pressure applied over a larger area. And that's just, that's mechanical fact.
Right, exactly. That's the physics behind it. So one thing that I've noticed, maybe you can talk about this a little bit, is I see very little and often no what we would refer to as tongue relief in the bars of the spade bit. And of course, relief being sort of a misnomer to a lot of folks, thinking that it's a good thing, but I always refer to relief as something from like a topographical term in a map, the relief being just a change in elevation. That becomes basically a place for the tongue to jam, so that the bars of the mouth are what gets encountered primarily by the bars of the bit, and we don't see that, or at least I don't see that. I don't know, in the spade bit. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah, the spade bit, being a protection bit, it doesn't have that place where if you apply pressure, the tongue squeezes up into that gap to allow them to put more pressure on the bars, the gums of the horse. It doesn't have that. The tongue is super strong on a horse. I mean, if anybody that's ever warmed one or done any teeth work knows how strong. I mean, it's one of the strongest muscles in their body, I believe. Mm-hmm. And so they can protect themselves a lot with their tongue. You know, they can do a lot with that. You know, if I watch them, we were out gathering today, you know, my horse is eating the tops of thistles. You know, they're pretty tough.
Right.
So, you know, that, I think that is one of those things, you know, when we talk about relieving tongue relief, it is a misnomer. I think it's not actually true. I think it's one of those things that it's just not helping the horse that much.
Right. It sure sounds good, though.
A lot of people that think that, you know, I think spade bit's got kind of a bad rap. People put them on horses like to stop them or something.
Mm-hmm.
What you find out pretty quickly is that they're really a terrible leverage bit. They're an excellent signal bit, but they're really not a good leverage bit. If they were a great leverage bits, wouldn't they be using them still in ring cattle horse and reining? You know, it's just not true. They're just not very good to pull on. And the whole thing is you want to use just little motions with it, just little jiggles for signal. And that's what it's for. It's a great signaling bit. It communicates a lot about direction and things with the pieces that it has, the braces and so on. And it also, I believe, helps stretch your top line a little bit. Having that mouthpiece work up a little bit higher into the palate, when it's set in a place, that horse will tend to stretch those last three vertebrae on the poll, and that's one of the you know, things that you see that is kind of the mark of a great bridle horse, is that he will be a little bit stretchier in that area.
Okay.
A swan neck.
A swan neck. Gotcha. More reaching through the top line to the bit then.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm thinking what you said about the kind of using the small movements and the horse picking up on those, and if the horse is carrying himself in the right position, or if the bit is balanced in the right position based on the horse's conformation or anatomy or whatever, I'm thinking in my mind from the anatomical perspective, those smaller signals are going to help the horse to stay more relaxed through the tongue and through the top line. And then, as you said, kind of the being a protective sort of a bit, if we have to take a hold of it for whatever reason, or if the horse bears onto it, that would do less detriment maybe to those sensitive tongue muscles and even to the hyoid itself. And we know that if there's tension in the horse's tongue, then there's going to be tension through the top line and through the scapula and through the sternum and all of those other places. So having the horse educated to work off of that signal of the bit, off of the gentle kind of rocking and swaying, is going to keep the jaw more mobile and the tongue softer, yeah?
Yeah, I believe it does. I think, you know, it's really, you know, I do a demonstration with a skull, and it's set up with a tongue and everything in it. And, you know, once people see how it fits in the mouth, it's pretty ingenious. You know, that's what really keeps me excited about teaching it, and is, you know, it's a really scientific system. It's very passive. It's not a forceful system. And horses, the guys that designed this rode horses a lot and did a lot of things with them. And, you know, they were historically, you know, really, really great horses. And, you know, the horse can learn to work just really quickly and work through himself really well and engage the hind end, but do incredibly fast turns and stops. And you can do it without moving your hands hardly at all. You know, because generally the horses, once you know, synchronize your seat balance point to that bit balance point, everything works together and it's very seamless. And I always say, you know, when I'm really on my game and my horse is with me, you shouldn't be able to see anything happen. There should be no visible signal. You know, it's a secret between him and I.
Yes.
What we're talking about.
Yes.
And, you know, and that's why I keep doing it.
That's awesome. And arguably the same could be said for all good riding.
I think absolutely. It's like people who want to compare this or that. And, yes, I think all great riding is based off the seat.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care what you're doing. If you're thinking that a bit or a piece of equipment is going to enhance or detract from what you're doing, then I think there's something missing in the rest of your riding.
Yeah.
Because there's no, as anybody that's been around very much, there's no bit in the world that's going to make something happen. There's things that work consistently with the rest of the way you ride, and can help people, achieve maybe a little more consistency. But, none of that's going to create any of that. Good riding, good planning, good exercise, good drills, and just a good relationship with your horse is going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
One of the coolest things I think about this system is that it was developed, and I don't know, it's different than other Spanish colonial systems. Okay, you can look at Mexico or Brazil or Argentina. Those are all Spanish colonies about the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But only here did it really develop the way it did into this balance system. And it's also set up, it works like a horse works a horse. It doesn't get ahead of the horse and lead it somewhere. It kind of opens the door and then herds them through. And that's the way this system kind of works. And so you won't see people leading a horse from their back doing this kind of riding or getting ahead of the horse in any way.
Gotcha.
And that's why it works so good on cattle.
Okay.
Because the horses have to be the closest thing to the cow, not the person,
Yeah. So it works the similar balance then.
Get ahead of them. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, you said a minute or so ago something about you mentioned the guys that designed this system. Tell me about that. What do we know about the history of the California bridle horses?
Well, if we look, the padres brought up the cattle. Those and the first soldiers came into California. Most of the padres were pretty classically trained. The church actually ran the horse herd in Spain. They were in charge of breeding the horses. And these guys, they came up, into basically wilderness and set up their mission system. But what's different about California, or I believe it is, and this is my take on it, and what I've read and stuff, I think everywhere else where they established a mission system up through New Mexico and Texas and all that country that was, and Mexico, the Indians were more warlike. When they got over here to this coast, a lot of the Chumash and Catalino Indians were very kind of passive, friendly type Indians or indigenous people. And they started putting them on horseback even when it was against the law. It was punishable by death for indigenous people to be a horseback in Spanish ruled, the frontier. And so they started, because the herds did so well here on the mild climate and stuff, they started putting these kids that had herded them afoot, the sheep and the cattle afoot, and started putting them on horseback. And they developed these families of either Spanish and indigenous people mixed into these vaqueros. And these vaqueros were, phenomenal riders and horsemen. And I think that indigenous aspect, hunter-gatherer, studying animals the way they work, I think that brought more to this system than anything else. That's just my opinion. Just because it is so natural to horses. I mean, we ride a lot of horses that weren't started in this system, in our workshops and stuff, and they'll come into this in about 10 minutes. They'll just figure it out. They'll go, yeah, that's right. And they'll just start doing it, and it doesn't take a lot of training or drills or anything else. Horses like balance. And when they can find balance in a system, they really come into it and remain a lot happier.
Oh, and like you said, the balance itself becomes the reward. So then the horse would learn. I should be phrasing this as a question. Do you find that the horse learns then that they have a semblance of control then over that balance and over that release, and that's what makes them happier?
Absolutely.
Or I shouldn't say happier, but that's what helps them to seek that.
Yeah, they start searching for it. They search for the balance. So if you get out of, as we say, the signal is some type of disruption of balance. We disrupt the balance, and they'll start looking for it. But one of the neatest things is they don't look away from you. They look for it under you. And that's a big thing, I believe. What I found is, we used to pull horses away from us or kick them away from us or send them away from us, and they would do stuff. But when you change the balance and that horse turns underneath you and it returns to that balance, it starts to look for that. And so they're always trying to stay under the middle of you. And they turn underneath you, and they don't, you don't get the whiplash or the centrifugal force when they do that. On hard turns and hard runs. Okay. And,
so how would you use your seat?
Been down the few times and,
sure.
Take the cow down the hill.
Right. So how would you be using your seat in this to help the horse seek that balance?
Well, seat basically has three positions. There's kind of low and round, when you want to gather a horse into you, and that would be stop. It's kind of like, I would say, it's like trying to put your elbows into your pockets, to your front pockets. You just kind of get round, just like you want your horse to do. You want him to be round and flexible in his back and get heavy and rock into your hips a little bit. Middle of that is neutral, and up, like you're pushing somebody away from you, is go. And so basically you have those three things. Then you can add a little English, left or right, and that tells them, what to do is you get out of their way of their spine. So if you want to turn to the left, move your spine slightly to their right. And where that opens up the bar pad on there, and the horse will come through, and then you get back to the middle. So the other leg can come through, of course, but you go back to neutral, and it becomes where the reins are really just, all they do is keep the horse from pushing too far forward or getting, they just keep them balanced. That's all they do.
Okay. So low and round. Yeah, right. Well, yeah, and exactly. There's only so much explanation we can give through an audio like this. Without having a horse there in front for somebody to see, But so you're talking of three seat positions: low and round, neutral, and up. When would the neutral position be there? Just when you're going with the horse, following the movement he's giving?
If you're in that neutral position, it's the center of your seat and the center of your saddle, and that's why you don't want a saddle that pushes you back on. Like a lot of Western riders, they say sit on your pockets. Well, then you got to kick it every step. We want to be in the center of our seat. And so where the horse can move you, and so you're like in the center of a scale, if you will. Okay. The horse is moving you, so you're in perfect time because he's moving you to that time. If you're in the very center, the seam of your pants, basically, with your heels underneath your hips and your shoulders, a good riding position, not with your feet kicked out in front of you and your butt sitting down like you're sitting, the riding position. Mm-hmm. And I would call it more of a classical seat.
Yes.
And if you look at the old California saddles, they were real flat in the middle, high in the front and back, but flat in the middle. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of just how they rode. And we try to do that what got me on, it changed my feet a lot, because I've gotten into the range horse in the rain and, sit on your pockets, but you have to push them every step, And so, what I want to do is engagement without force. And so if you get in the middle, you can engage that horse a lot more with a lot more passivity. The flow is better. And so, that's one of the things that I really work on is creating collection without creating tension. And so if you're in the right place, if you're sitting and pushing, you've got to use a lot of tension because you're blocking half the movement anyway.
Sure. So you want to be in the easiest place for the horse to carry you, basically.
Yeah, and where his movement is going to tie your seat, and then then all the when you pick him is pretty simple because he's moving you, so you can pick him in that motion.
Okay.
When you pick, I say pick when you change something. When you signal.
Okay. So what would you say that you look for in a horse? And I guess first I would say, would you say that there's maybe a horse that's better to be a hackamore horse or a two-rein horse or a bridle horse? Or do you think that you're going to kind of take all of them the whole way through this system?
I think horses that tend to be a little more upright, uphill built, seem to be a little easier to bring through the system. But mostly it's, horses that are just willing. I like a horse that's just got a kind eye and just a nice horse. Got decent conformation. It's athletic, but specifically, we ride everything. I have some Spanish horses, and I really like those because I got into some of the Andalusians and Azteca, and I got into those because I wanted to see, kind of how the system was developed on Spanish horses. And so, early California horses were Spanish horses. And it really hits home with them. But almost every other horse that we've ridden in our workshops, it does relate to them very well. Because I think all horses want to be in balance.
Mm-hmm.
It's how much collection, you want to think about. Does that horse have a strong enough hind end to really drive and to support that? I tend to like horses that stop pretty hard, so I like them with a low tail set.
Okay.
Big hip, big strong hip.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think there's any. It's like anything, if you go through the process and you help the horse along, they change. A horse that is developed, it's just like, you take an athlete and you give it specific exercises for whatever event it's going to participate in. And that horse's body or that person's body is going to change and develop. It's just knowing what you want and figuring out exercises that are going to enhance that.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
I guess in dressage they call it, gymnastics.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So let's say we've got a horse then that is just really downhill built. Like I'm going to say some of the modern Western pleasure horse. Maybe I'll send that out there. Those horses by nature and by the design of their body, for the most part, are arguably downhill enough that they may never be able to reach an actual state of collection in the way that we talk about balance, but we could get them closer to a balanced state.
Yeah, I think once they figured out that, it's like a lot of horses are like me going to the gym. You know, I don't want to do it.
Okay.
I just do not want to work out and stuff. But I figure out when I am in better shape, things get easier. And so when that horse figures out that, you know, if it packs a little more weight on its hind end and it engages that hind end more, he finds that life is a lot easier. He becomes happier. You know, it's just like anybody. If you walk around with your head down, you know, you're not going to be a very bright and energetic person. And so, you know, those horses, once they figure out, you know, that they move easier, you know, it's the same reason they teach armies to march, you know, is that when they get their chest up and they start to reach with their feet, everything, it becomes easier. They can do more and withstand it. So it's one of those things. They don't necessarily like it in the beginning. They have to be taught in a slow progression. You know, a lot of people think, you know, that a headset is collection.
Right.
And I think anybody that's really well educated in horses understands that, no, the headset is the product of collection. A good headset is the product of collection, not the other way around.
Right.
You know, and that's, I think, you know, one of the things is people get worrying about setting that head before they bring the hind end to driving and reaching forward. And if they quit worrying about that and get the rest of the horse set up for it, that chin's going to drop off, and they're going to be able to collect and do what everybody says, ride them from back to front.
Yeah, right. So when the haunches are right and the back is right, basically the neck will take care of itself.
Yeah.
Within reason, of course.
Yeah. And so, you know, yeah, I think there's degrees. I think there's horses that you're probably going to start out and you're going to create a lot more work than maybe if you'd have found one that was a little closer to your ideal. I take one, you know, when I look at colts, I just take one and I look at it, and I look at it when it moves in its own collection. You know, horses will collect up when they play with another horse or when they're doing something on their own. And I look at that and I go, yeah, that's kind of the picture I like, and that's the horse I pick.
So you want to see one going around that's about as close to what you want the finished picture to look like when he's without you, so that you can create that when he's with you.
Yeah, I think that if it's there, you know, you see young horses and you go, yeah, that horse moves the way that, you know, it's my picture in my head. So, you know, and that's, I guess it just depends on the individual picture. I think that it is an art. And so I know the picture I want to create. And so when I have an ideal look, that's what I want to do. And I think that's, you know, up to the individual a lot. I don't like to put this, you know, cookie cutter aspect into it. You know, I think each person, you know, it's like some people, well, you can't go in the bridle because your horse is not doing flying leads or something. Well, maybe the person never wants to. Maybe they just want to ride on around the trail, have a nice horse that has a little gather to it and looks good. You know, that's more power to them.
Gotcha. Yeah, if that's what they're looking for, then why would it be wrong by anybody's standards?
Right. If they're enjoying their horse and, you know, they like what they're doing, their horse is happy, then I see no fault in it.
Awesome. Well, that brings me to another question that I had here. When you talk about this system was designed by riders that were, you know, at least theoretically riding their horses 10 to 12 hours or more a day, getting a job done, covering lots of country, that sort of stuff. I think it's realistic for us to say that that's not the case with most modern riders. They're, you know, riding their horse after they get out of the office and in between taking the kids to soccer and cheerleading and dance and things like that. And, you know, of course, there's people that are riding their horses more than that, but most of us are with fixed schedules that we're not riding our horses 10 to 12 hours a day. And covering lots of ground. So is this a system that we would maybe say then is not suitable for those riders, or is there a way that they can adapt and still think about this balance even though they've not got that long a time or that much of a job to do with their horse?
I think it's very suitable, you know, because it really does relate to the horse. That's what I love about it, is that you can get on and it doesn't take a lot of drilling and training. If you find the balances in the equipment and in yourself. I mean, you can do it for 20, 30 minutes. It's actually better, you know, anytime you build a collection is to not go very long, you know. And in the beginning, you know, being a dressage rider and stuff, you know, you build collection moments at a time.
Yes.
And over a long period of time. And, you know, that, so, you know, if a person rides a half hour, an hour, or something like that, no, it's a really neat system for that. In that horses stay, for me, having done a lot of different stuff, it's just they stay happy. They enjoy their work, and, you know, they come to the gate every day and meet them. And so for me, that's one of the biggest aspects of it, and why, you know, I decided to share it. You know, I didn't want to do workshops or clinics, you know, at first, but people kept saying, you know, you got to teach this. And I was like, well, you know, I didn't invent any of this stuff. I just looked at all the equipment, and I got to a point where I just reverse engineered everything. And so then I adjusted my riding to the parameters that this equipment worked. And when I did that, my horses got a lot better.
Gotcha. So that's going to take me to a question of choosing good equipment. How do you go about, let's take it apart piece by piece. How would you go about picking a good hackamore?
Well, a good hackamore generally, you know, is as a ride core. It's not cable or it's well braided.
You don't want to use one of those big honking steel nose bands I saw hanging on a tack shop wall?
No. Find it something, you know, that's finely braided. I recommend people use, you know, latigo or rawhide at first. You don't want to scuff a horse up. You know, I see a lot of people riding hackamores and they've got their jaws scuffed up and stuff. That's not necessary, and it's not a good practice. You know, it happens to the best of us occasionally, you know, if you get out and a bunch of calves are running back or something. But, you know, generally you want something that's pliable enough. I always say when people are learning, use something that's not too abrupt.
Yes.
And so, you know, if they do tend to hold on them, the worst thing you can do on a hackamore horse is hold it. It's a movement, and it's a lift and release. It's never a pull, steady kind of an operation, because they just get really dull. So I say use something soft, latigo. You know, it can have a rawhide nose button, because that's another thing with a hackamore. It's a lift. All this system is lifting up. None of it's pulling back. You know, whether you're using a bridle or a hackamore, it's a lift system. And the reason is, you know, your horn is one of your biggest tools to go around with your dallies. And so if you're pulling back, you're covering, you know, your horn.
Yeah.
So everything's designed to lift. And that's one of the things that got me off Snaffle, that you couldn't really use it effectively how it's designed to be used, one-handed or high-handed. And where most people say, you know, use low hands, well, that doesn't really make any difference to a hackamore. More lift you got, the better it works. So, but anyway, soft is a good way to start. You know, there's a lot of quality makers out there. Find something that feels pretty good. Generally 5/8, you know, it depends on what you're doing. If you're starting a horse, most of our horses now are pretty nice horses. They're not the old coarse horses, so you don't need a 3/4 or anything like that. 5/8 usually works fine. And you go have that, maybe a 1/2 inch and a 3/8 for your underbridle. And, you know, and once that horse learns to work a little bit, you can go to a hackamore with a little more body, a little more feel to it, because he'll know how to work, and so he'll be able to stay in that without getting, you know, your hands getting too abrupt.
Okay.
Because it's just like you or I. If somebody jerks on us or something, first thing we're going to do is tense up.
Yes.
And I don't want my horse to tense up. I want it to relax into the feel. soften into the feel, not to be afraid of it. And so, you know, you don't want something that feels like a stick.
Gotcha. Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
They sell stick horses at Tractor Supply. We can go there if we want one of those.
Yeah. But, yeah, so, you know, and that's something, it's hard to describe, you know, just a good feeling Hackamore. There's several guys that build them.
Mm-hmm.
From there, you know, you have a small Abosolito, we call it, that we use as a two-rein, and it's the same thing. It's just smaller, and so it'll use under the bridle. The bridles, there's several people making them. What you want is a good balance. When you hold that bit in the palm of your hand and move it back and forth, it won't move a lot. I use just Santa Barbara cheeks because they have that counterbalance, that bell.
Okay.
And they're very, very steady neutral position. You can move your hand up and down, and that mouthpiece will not move unless you engage it. And the angle that mouthpiece sets as it sits in your palm, it'll have a neutral position. And I pick one that is laid back, so it doesn't sit at vertical. You don't want your horse at vertical all the time. What you want to do is, if you engage that bridle, if you pick up on it, it may go to vertical, but you don't want it at vertical, because when you engage it, it'll take the horse behind vertical.
Gotcha, yes.
He's really following that mouthpiece. So you want something just ahead of vertical. That's kind of how your horse packs itself, you know, when it's working.
Gotcha. So depending on your horse's natural head carriage, say you've got one that wants to nose out a bit more, would you be looking for a bit that would, in its neutral angle, match maybe kind of, we could call it the neutral angle of your horse's head while he's going?
A little more laid back, yeah.
Okay.
And that, you know, if he was developed well in the Hackamore, he should develop, you know, it's the natural carriage after you complete the Hackamore process. You know, you wouldn't take them before you were started and go. Unless you were looking at them as a baby, they all kind of carry themselves pretty right.
Yeah.
But, you know, through the Hackamore process, once he's learned to kind of use his hind end and stuff, then you'd look at him and evaluate that. Yeah, and you'd have one that tips back, what they call lays back a little bit more. And for a lot of, like, horses I ride, you know, we've had a lot of, like, cut and bred horses, stock bar horses and stuff. Okay. And they tend to run a little flatter, you know, especially when they're working cattle, they'll tend to get a little flat on you. And, you know, we'd have one that's a little more laid back for those guys. And that works, it seems to work really well.
Gotcha. Okay. Great. Great. Now, what about this idea of a half-breed? What would can you tell our listeners what that half-breed is and what you would look for with that? Or would you even be interested in using that in this system?
A lot of people do. I don't really agree with the, you know, in the new system, the newer type system, a lot of people go to a half-breed and then to the Spade. Well, the half-breed is a very quick bit, you know. It doesn't have braces, so it doesn't have anything to slow that rotation down. And basically, it's just a straight bar with a staple in the center of it, you know, a tall, narrow mouthpiece with a roller. Okay. And so it's a pretty quick bit. And you didn't really see a lot of those in my research. You didn't see a ton of them before, like, World War I. And I think what happened is a lot of guys came back, and this California system was the whole western slope of the Rockies at one point. You know, even in Montana, if you look at Charlie Russell paintings, they're all Spade guys from in California brands. But I think when they came back from the war, there was a lot of older horses, and they needed something they didn't use a lot of snaffle bits. You know, there was not a lot of snaffle bits used in this country at that time. And I think they needed something that they could grab a hold of, and maybe even one rein, a bridle. And so they could do that in a half-breed, and they couldn't do that in the Spade. And I think that's where it became more popular. you know, and that's just one of those things. As you see that through after World War One, then you got the Depression in Oklahoma, people coming up here, and those things became more prevalent, and a lot of the California stuff started fading out. You know, and a lot of that whole thing about a spade bit being real severe. Well, if you see a guy and his horse is spinning and sliding and stuff, and he's moving his hand in a 2-inch square, and you come from a pressure-based system, you're probably going to think that bit's real severe.
Yeah, it'd be easy to misunderstand that.
Yeah, it would be easy to misunderstand if that's what you're used to working off of.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's not really part of the system for what I do. I find that I would have to, there's signal in a half breed, but I would have to be so much more careful and so much more precise with my hand to use the signal in it before it engaged. Because it's quick to lever.
Yes, gotcha. Because there's less surface area to stop the rotation.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, there's just not as much to stop the rotation, and there's not as much signal. You know, the braces do create a bit of signal, but mostly they're for that horse to protect itself.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. Let's see. Looking over my questions here. So you were talking about the snaffle bits, and you said in the classical system we don't see the use of the snaffle bits like we seem to do with a lot of guys now, snaffle bit then hackamore. And it sounds like you've done a lot of research. Do you have any idea as to when the snaffle bit kind of came onto the scene and how that got involved?
Well, I think it came in with the Anglo coming into Spanish California, you know, an influx of them, a great deal of them during the gold rush, and a little bit prior to that. They came in here and started acquiring land and things. And, you know, I mean, most of them were Teamster-based. They didn't even have a lot of carriages and stuff in California. They had ox carts for traveling. So they were not driving people. You know, and I think when the driving people came into California, that started becoming more prevalent. You know, but there was still a lot of just true diehard hackamore people and stuff until, you know, the 70s. It changed a lot when a lot of the people got together and they decided, you know, we need to be able to make money on these horses faster, and they created the futurities.
Yeah.
You know, and so we need to, you know, get these horses in at 2 and train them and then show them at 3. Well, then that snaffle became a lot more prevalent. I think it also took a hold in the Great Basin a lot more too, is because a lot of, you know, real fresh, snotty horses, and you know, they were easier to get by in a snaffle bit.
Gotcha.
Than they are hackamore. You know, they didn't take the time to train them like they did earlier in California. You know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, would you say that with the rein leathers or the slobber straps on a snaffle bit, would you say that it's possible to ride a horse in the snaffle bit thinking about that balance and that signal that you talk about?
I think you can. I think a seat, you know, your seat signal, it's the biggest influence on a Western horse anyway, right? I mean, you look at a Western tree, you know, and it's got 4 bar pads. And so if you can influence those bar pads to create signal, real easy to open doors and close doors. So, yeah, I think it is. I don't think it has a neutral position. You know, it just kind of hangs there. The horse hangs his head right. The problem I see with it, why I don't, you know, subscribe to it anymore. And I mean, I've shown them this now 53, so it's not like I'm foreign to them.
Right.
But it's just the fact that it's not consistent to the bridle. The hackamore and the bridle work almost exactly the same. They work on the reins underneath, and they can't be twisted too much, you know, and so they work. They're very, very consistent from one to the next. Where a snaffle bit works on the side of the face, and it does not work very well lifting, right? Because as soon as you lift it up, you're going to get into the teeth, because the only thing protecting the teeth is the lips of the horse.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's why you have to have low hands with the snaffle bit, so you can stay in that dental groove. And when you lift up on it, it tends to get into the teeth.
Mm-hmm.
And so that just didn't make sense to me, and really got me studying that. And then I found out, you know, I thought I needed one to create different things, but, you know, if your horse is good in the body and has flexion, you can create flexion and any kind of a shape in the horse. You need something that he respects on his head, not some specific piece of equipment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's just about the consistency from one to the next, because my horses are destined to be bridle horses. That's all I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
So that's more of the thing. But I think, yeah, there's guys that ride them very well.
Yeah, but it's interesting that talking about the lifting of the hands, because in the classical dressage system, you know, we talk about the boucher flexions, where there is an elevation of the hands to achieve the flexions of the jaw, the releasing of the jaw and the releasing of the top line. And interestingly enough, when you ride a horse with the boucher style flexions in mind, with that elevation, you're teaching the horse to kind of lift at the base of the neck through the contact on the lips of the snaffle bit. And very much from what I've seen and experienced myself with riding in the hackamore and with playing with the idea of the boucher flexions, they start to carry themselves in a very similar balance. So it is very interesting how then the classical side of both ends of that, you know, the classical Western, as we could call it, and the classical dressage are looking for that same carriage, that same balance that we're talking about.
Oh, absolutely. That's where the horse is the handiest.
Yes, exactly.
You know, I mean,
exactly, right.
That's all. Yeah, I think that's all, you know, dressage has become a thing, but originally it was just to have a really handy horse that you could move and not get stabbed at.
Right, and so much of it came from the same horses, right? You know, so much of it came from the conquistadors, the Spanish and the Portuguese riders, the bullfighters, and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. You know, I mean, that all comes, you know, the Spanish riding school in Vienna, you know, they don't call it Spanish riding school for nothing. It's, you know, it's based on...
right.
It's based on that, and I did a lot of study on that when I was trying to re-educate myself to learning the system better. I read a lot of that stuff because that's what's written. There's not much written about this style, you know, that's real accurate or easy to digest. And that there's some really good stuff written there and a lot of detail.
Right.
And you can see it definitely is hand in hand. They just took that system and then made it a little bit more passive. I call it, instead of direct, it's more passive.
Okay.
It's an indirect contact.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, for the longer days and stuff. But I believe, you know, where a nicely ridden dressage horse, he's gathered most of the time, where this one, he engages and gathers, and then he can be let out and just kind of travel on his own. He learns to pack himself. Self-carriage is a big deal for us. We want them to do it on their own. We don't want to, because we've got too much other things going on to help them all the time.
Right, right. So they need to be able to find that natural state of balance and that, like you said, self-carriage without a lot of help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't want to have to help them. You know, I'll help them along the way. I'll show them where it is, and I'll keep showing them where it is. But I'm not going to hold them up.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So you were talking about doing a lot of studying and reading a lot of the old texts about dressage, and I mean they've been writing books about dressage since Jesus was a paper boy. But it is very hard, like you said, to find writings or documentation of the bridle horse process. What are some of the things that you did find? I know I've read some books by Ed Connell, guys like that. What's the farthest back that you've been able to find?
Well, now and then you read just, you know, manuscripts from certain people. Some of the best information I've gotten is from a friend of mine that mentored me. He's 93, and his dad was a very notable vaquero. And he was a buckaroo his whole life. And so I try to get him talking a lot about those old guys, you know, and there you could see a transition through the years. A lot of his stuff he did in the 40s and stuff. And there was still very, very strong California influence in, you know, traditional style, but it was starting to get mixed, you know. He still, you know, he makes a funny face when you say quarter horse, you know, because they didn't care for him very much. You know, they rode what they call California horses, which were Spanish horses,
Okay.
basically, and Morgan crosses.
Ah, okay.
So they were very, you know, kind of an upright horse as well. But when you start to glimpse those little pieces of it, you know, and the best teacher is really the tools that they developed. And people go, you know, I mean, I've seen 1,000 worn out spade bits. I mean, worn out that have been used and used and used, you know, from as far back as, you know, the 18s. I've got one here from, you know, 1870s. And when you start to look at that and the way, you know, people, a lot of things they think are ornamentation, they really aren't. The buttons, you know, how many buttons are on the bell makes a difference in how a bit lays back. You know, there's stories of...
It's not just for being pretty?
What's that?
It's not just for being pretty?
No, they're not for just being pretty.
Not just to show off to your friends?
No, they're actually, you know, there's a good story just a few miles down the coast from where I live. Mardueno, who's noted to be, who kind of developed the Santa Barbara cheek and bit. And they said, you know, the vaqueros would come between Santa Barbara and Ventura, and he had a shop set up on the beach there. And when they'd ride up there in their Hackmore horses, he'd watch that horse, and then he'd build them a bit. When they came back by, they'd pick up that bit for that horse.
Okay.
You know, and he would try to make that with the balance and watch, you know, the way the horse moves and stuff, and build a bit for it. You know, the weight of how many buttons you had on your reins. I mean, it's pretty scientific when you get into it. Most people will never feel that differences, but they really had it dialed in, and it was important to them. And that's the things talking to my friend, Ray Ordaway. You know, he goes, you know, they had very, very strict rules in families about how they did things and how they rode. But that's what they kept it in their families. You know, they didn't share it. Nobody told anybody else, you know, that was their deal. But it's like everything, you know. He said when there was 10 or 12 of them together, every one of them had a different opinion about it.
Yeah, right.
That hasn't changed.
And it probably never will, right?
Probably never will. But I think that's what keeps us learning, you know.
Yes, exactly. Well, hopefully we can just get more of this stuff recorded so that there's more opinions to read about and to hear about and to watch later on.
Yeah, you see, you know, a lot of people are into the details. One of my things has been you can simplify it, you know, make it a little more digestible, because there's so much mystery and mystique, you know, and fairy tales put on this stuff that, you know, but it's really a very viable system that still has a lot of merit today. I find that, you know, people that are not, you know, in a rush to go to the futuries and stuff really care about the longevity and the sustainability of their horses, really like this system. You know, and that's what we're about. We're about sustainability. How we do things. We want our horses to stay sound, and we want them to become lighter and lighter until they're 20, you know, not burned out when they're 8. Right.
Lighter, more fit, more athletic, more usable.
Yeah, it's just like it's a progression of lightness, and that's what kind of really sends me onto it, is that I've done a lot of things and done a lot of performance horse things, and it was progression of force.
Yeah.
You know? And I mean, it's like when you get to where you're progressing because something you were doing wasn't working any longer, then there's something wrong with your system, and you got to reevaluate.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Yeah, there's something that is amiss in the philosophy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you mentioned Fairytales, and and I'm glad you did, because this is something I want to chat with you about briefly, maybe, or we can expand on it if we want to. But you read, if anybody gets on any of these forums or these chat rooms or all this Facebook stuff, you read about how much better the horsemen used to be and how much better the horses used to be and all of that fun stuff. And while you're talking here, you're talking about how scientific the work was that they did, and in the design of the bridles and things like that, or the bits. We are so much more educated now than we were as a general society at that point, and we're breeding horses now to be legitimately so much better than they were at that time. What kind of merit do you think there is to the idea that the fairy tale vaquero was riding a better horse or was doing things that much better than what we can create now?
Well, I think it's like all those things. I think there was extremely good riders. I don't think they were mounted that well. For one thing, they were on horses, that were 14, 30 or something,
Yeah, right.
You look at the saddles, and they've never had a flake of hay in their whole lives. Right. I mean, and honestly, even some of the older photos that you look at, you see horses with upside down top lines and just shit conformation. Yeah. No, we're definitely, the breeding has come a long way. The science was good, and I think you can find examples of good Spanish horses. There was most of the things you see photos of were that transitional period when they started bringing in other breeds and breeding them with California horses.
Okay,
and it became from a hide and tallow to a beef market.
Okay,
and that changed a lot. And I mean, also, you got to think too, those guys, it wasn't that fancy, I mean, when your job is to rope stuff and cut their throats and skin their eyes, it's probably a mess.
Right, right. They're not sitting around polishing their silver, are they?
Yeah. So, I mean, the reality should come in there. I think there was excellent examples of great horsemanship, and you can see that what they developed, when you look at it inside of a horse skull or inside of a mount, I mean, they really understood the animals.
Yeah.
I think they did that very well, and I think they spent a ton of time at it, more than we do now.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're better educated, but we're not immersed in it. If you think about your only mode of transportation anywhere was your horse.
Yeah.
And for these, especially these, they were basically peons, I mean, they were the vaqueros. They were the highest form in the, working society.
Mm-hmm.
Because everybody else, if you think about a mission, you go there and you're making candles or you're skinning cattle or you're building adobe bricks.
Mm-hmm.
And then the vaqueros, they got to leave and be out amongst the cattle. So it was a very prestigious job. And I think that's where some of that mystique comes in. But, also, in reality, it's just still cowboy. It's always a lot prettier on pictures.
Right. And there is always the mystique of the cowboy, right? Everybody wants to be a cowboy till it's time to do cowboy stuff.
Yeah, exactly. But, so I think, you take it with a grain of salt. I think there is a system there that is definitely worth people in modern times to look at. Mm-hmm. And that's what I want to do, preserve the good parts. There's probably some pretty brutal stuff going on too.
Sure.
But I think there's enough of being able to create collection in a horse and have them be happy and do it without a lot of tension.
There you go.
And I think that's an admirable goal for any rider.
Yes.
And so the more the horse engages, the better he performs. But if he can do this without a lot of force, without a lot of tension, I think that that's a good thing. And this system does create a lot of that. So.
Yeah. Awesome. Very cool. Well, I would love to go with a couple questions that we've got here. If you don't mind, we'll go to some audience questions.
Sure.
Cool. We've got one here from Eddie, and I know Eddie has been really looking forward to our chat here since I told him that we were going to have you on here. So Eddie says, the biggest question I get about the two-rein, he rides his horse right now in a two-rein, the biggest question I get about the two-rein and the spade bit is why? Why use such a, he has in quotes, nasty bit? How would you respond to these other horse people that don't understand that bit? And how would you explain the why would you do that? So I'm going to take it a step further. If you can ride that horse in the hackamore, why would you move on to something else?
Well, and that's so that you can do less. I mean, you're telling them what you're going to do. You can ride that horse in the hackamore, and it takes a little more movement to signal a horse in the hackamore than it does in the bridle. And to preserve that lightness that you've obtained in the hackamore, you're going to use that bridle as an amplifier of those signals. And so that's what I tell people. And I said, I understand that you don't understand this. If this was in your mouth, it would be huge. But then you have to show them, that the jaw of a horse is about 1.5 feet long.
Right.
And you're covering 4 inches of it. Mm-hmm. So, in the ratios, it actually fits much better than most bits. Most bits are working on they're only working on the lower jaw. And they're working on about the last 10% of the lower jaw, and that's all they're working on. Mm-hmm. And where a spade bit incorporates the top, the palate, and the lower jaw, and then it has the coverage. So it gives you a real good signal and a good place for a horse to follow to stay with the bridle, because it has enough for him to stay with. Mm-hmm. And so that's the way I kind of explain it. But a lot of people, as soon as you say spade bit or show them spade bit, their mind shuts off. Yep. But, you can wrap a little wire around their finger and a big wire or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's hard to tell people, ride your own horse. But
yeah, well, there's that, right?
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. Okay, great. So we have a question from Heidi. Super awesome question, I think. Heidi wants to know, how do you go about picking the right kind of spade bit for your horse?
For me, it's about that balance point, that neutral position. For one thing, like I say, there's some that I don't really care for. A lot of the Las Cruces bits, they look like a pendulum, so they work back and forth like a pendulum. Okay. So anything that's real solid, where you can put it in the palm of your hand and move it back and forth, and it does not fluff around very much. So you kind of create the movement of the horse, and then it'll stay in a balanced position. It'll stay still in your hand. Then it'll stay still in that horse's mouth. And if it stays still in his mouth, then it's only signaling when you engage it, when you pick up on a rein or something. Okay, so if it's flopping around back and forth, and I think this is for anybody, if it's flopping back and forth, then it's always talking. So how pick those signals out? Mm-hmm. Other than the curb strap engaging.
Right.
That's what I look for a lot in that, and then also, being at an angle that looks like your horse can carry on its own.
Gotcha. So kind of going with that mouth angle that matches the mouth angle or the head angle for the horse when he's in more of a neutral position.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So where do you this isn't part of Heidi's question, but where would you go about finding a good spade bit, and how would you, is that something that you would try to build for your horse? I mean, obviously you're going to know your horse and where he's going to naturally carry himself. How do you go about picking that? I mean, is it kind of like a buffet style lineup where you say, I want this cheek piece, I want this mouthpiece, I want this, you know, this style of
like I say,
slobber
I
bar?
use the Santa Barbara cheek because I find that balance is best. So I always start with that. I have a specific maker that builds most of mine.
Okay.
There's a few guys out there that kind of build on that pattern. I use him because he actually he has about 150 original Merdueño spade bits, and which tend to have a lower bell and stronger neutral position. And I have them build them. Unfortunately, the old ones don't fit our modern horses.
Sure, because the modern horses are very different in conformation.
Right. Yeah, and they're much, you know, if you look at the old spades, they're usually like 4 3/4 wide. You know, they practically won't even fit Arabs or anything.
Right.
They're very narrow, but they're very wide in the spoon. So they were very narrow mouth, but very wide palated. And it's something that's kind of odd. So he builds them, you know, with a narrower spoon where the brace is attached. And what I did is I went around with guys doing teeth, and we just measured a bunch. And so it's kind of like finding the right saddle fit. You know, you find something that's close. Yep. And he tends to build them to where they have a really good neutral position, and they're pretty standard. I mean, you can have them lay them back a little more or forward a little more, depending on your horses. A lot of my horses are Spanish horses, and they tend to like one a little more straight up because that's how they pack themselves. Where in the quarter horses, I have them laid back a little bit. But so I go with him, and there's 2 or 3 other guys that have kind of learned from him. But I find that he does a good job. I don't know, I can plug him, I guess. Bruce Sandifer is who I use. Okay.
Yeah, Bruce. I've heard of Bruce. I've seen a lot of his bits that he's created. Yeah. Fantastic.
Bruce Sandifer, Andrew Rombuck over in Germany, Richard Brooks in Canada built an awful nice bit. And there's several guys out there, you know. For me, I like the braces set back from the cannon bar a little bit, not directly over the top and real close to it. I want that horse to have enough room between the braces and the cannon bar that he can actually use his lips to slow down the rotation. You'll see a lot of bits built in the 50s and stuff. They'll run the brace right along the cannon bar. And I think that was in an effort when they were still showing with spades that they could rotate a little faster and get a little more curve action.
Okay. Gotcha. So that's going to take us into Anne's question. Anne puts in, I'm wondering if you're looking at the shape of the horse's mouth. I'm assuming she's talking on the inside, and that's going to go into what you were talking about with measuring the insides of the horse's mouth and that sort of thing. What are you measuring for? What are you looking for in there?
Well, with the teeth, you know, the molars, the first 2 premolars, you know, that point is kind of a critical location. You want something that's not resting on teeth. And, you know, and then the width of the bit, too, is kind of important. And what I do is I have a real scientific way. I take a chopstick and I put it in their mouth, and I measure, you know, I mark both.
Oh, okay.
I don't want it too compressed. You know, I don't want any binding on my bit. I want it to be able to move freely and, you know, not pinch up on their lips or anything like that. So because action, you know, when I move it, because it's a movement, you want free moving. Well, that's another thing. Bending out your bridle rings at you know, where at the bit hanger, you want to bend those out enough that your two rein, if you're using the two rein, that it freely moves so that the heel knot can drop.
Yeah, you don't want that, because if that's too straight, that'll compress against the cheeks then, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. And so they'll get hung up and stuck. And so you want everything to function how it should, you know. And it's kind of hard. We do a lot. I bridle a ton of horses for people in my workshops, you know, and it's one of those things where, you know, there's a lot of good production bits made out there. Jeremiah Watt built a couple that are based on Arduino designs. There's, you know, some few other guys. And, you know, horses will get by. Most people are not going to feel a whole lot of difference. One of the biggest questions they get is, well, when can I engage it? When can I pull on the bridle rein? It's like, well, the whole idea of a two-rein is that you don't really pull on the bridle rein.
Right, right.
Is so that you teach that horse that when you change without engagement, just changing your reins by lifting your reins but not pulling on the bit, that's enough signal to create any movement that you want out in your seat. You know, that's the idea behind it. It's not something that's a good pulling device. You know, that's one of the hardest things to get people to realize that bit is not there for pulling like most bits that they're used to.
Right, right. Well, and that goes back to talking about working it off of the balance, like you mentioned.
Exactly.
Yeah, when you're pulling, you're disturbing the balance.
If you just use leverage, that's what they're going to make you use. The horse will get to where it makes you use it.
Yes.
And if you can use balance and just, you know, occasionally reinforce with the lever if you need it, then they'll stay really finely tuned on balance. The best thing about this system, if you kind of learn to use it correctly, is there's no fixing stuff. You don't have to go back and use a different bit or anything else. If you just stick with it, they get better over time. And a good bit, a nicely balanced with a good, strong neutral position will absolutely encourage that for years in a horse. So you don't run out of bullets.
There you go. There you go. So Anne has added, she loves the chopstick idea, and she's trying to measure her horse at present. She's having difficulty. She says, what about the depth of the palate? So how are you measuring that? Are you doing that when you've got the dentist there, or is that something you take into consideration, the depth of the palate?
Well, I haven't really, you know, if you're using, most of them are pretty flat. And so if they have, their tongue is pretty flexible, so it's going to fit up there.
Yeah.
If it fits in between the teeth, you're in pretty good shape. The depth, I mean, it could make a difference, you know, but generally, like I use what would be a fiddleback or a Spanish spade. It's kind of like a spade. It's not a big round spoon. I'm not a big fan of the spoon type. So they tend to fit up there pretty well. I've never had an issue with a palate on a spade. But, you know, what we do is before we bid a horse, we have the teeth done. We have them checked. Sure. And I like to look in there, you know, before we put any bid in them whatsoever, we like to do that. And just make sure there's no sharp edges or anything. Even on your hackamore horses, it's good to make sure that you don't have any hooks on your horse's teeth, because it's still pushing up against the side of their face. And so if you do that, you see horses get irritated and stuff. And a lot of times it's a simple thing like just having their teeth done.
Right.
You know, so.
Right, yeah, because the hooks and the ramps and things like that, you can end up with a lot of sharp edges on the outside of the teeth. And that, I mean, I've seen horses where the fit of the halter has even caused a lot of discomfort because of that. Yeah. Yeah,
watching that, you know, your palate, it's generally not too much of an issue, you know. It's more the angle. So if the horse carries itself, you know, that's the only trouble they're going to have if it pokes up. And then adjusting your curb strap is real important. You know, don't make it super loose. You see a lot of these guys with the tied curb straps on the bottom and stuff. Have one with 2 buckles, one on either side, and then you can adjust that pretty good. You know, it's where you can put 2 fingers flat in there, and then you won't stand that bit up. You know, because that's the one thing besides pulling out to the side with one rein that you don't want to do with a spade bit, and that is stand that bit up in that horse's mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, it's just like you, if you got toothpick stuck in your mouth.
Right,
you know?
right.
I don't know if you've ever done that.
I think I might have on occasion, once or twice. Yeah. It's not too pleasant.
You're flipping around in your mouth, you get stuck in there, and that's really comfortable.
Right. Yeah, there goes that game.
But, yeah, so, you know, those things, when you think about it, and a horse will mouth a bit, a lot, you know, you got to think of what they did on a snaffle bit. I know a lot of times, you know, we put a snaffle bit, you tie, you know, you have to tie a piece of hay string over the top of their forelock and stuff because they're lifting it so much. But if somebody puts a spade bit in the horse's mouth and it flips around a little bit, they freak out.
Sure.
But hates it.
Right.
Well, it just takes a little while for them to get used to it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because the bit talks, because it's always seeking its neutral position, it says stuff to that horse whether you pick up your reins or not. And so that takes them a little while to get used to, and that's the whole idea behind the cheering, is to encourage that horse, show them where that neutral is, show them where that neutral position is with your under bridle, with your 2-rein, so that he can figure that out quicker.
And again, you're saying that the bit is constantly talking to the horse whether you're engaging it or not, and that's because of the balance, yeah?
Right, because it's always seeking its balance at this point, right? So whether you do anything or not, it's trying to go to that place. And so it can be putting a little bit of, you know, pressure on the palate. You know, it's just uncomfortable. It's just like a hackamore. Too, what we didn't point in is why do you start with a heavy hackamore, right? Well, you start with a heavy hackamore because it encourages them to look for the place where that hackamore releases off their nose, where it falls off the point of their nose, right? So they lift their head up, and you got your big Macati and your big hackamore, and they flop around there, and it bounces up and down. Then you encourage them to look for that point where they put their head in the vertical, and it drops off their nose. And then as they learn that, you can go to a lighter and lighter one. And they'll do the same thing, you know, without that influence. A bit's no different. You know, a lot of people want a really light bit. Well, light bit bounces around a lot.
Yeah, right. There's a lot more mobility. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Absolutely.
And so I prefer a little heavier bit and reins in the beginning, and then as my horse gets more and more refined, I can lighten that up and use a smaller rein and a lighter bit. You know, that's just my ideas on it. But
yeah, for a more sophisticated conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You don't need the weight anymore. The horse knows where to carry itself, so less will tell it the same thing. And that's what I'm always looking for. How to do less and get more.
Yeah, and just to make sure that our listeners are understanding that, because we talked, you know, we mentioned before about the balance and about heavy and stuff like that. So the heavier bit, we're not saying we need more of a bit at the beginning when we say we want a heavier bit, but the weight of the bit, a slightly heavier bit, is going to actually sit more stable within its own balance than what the lighter bit is going to sit. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's it'll search its balance out a little more.
Yeah.
You know, usually they're about a pound, pound and a quarter, something like that is a pretty heavy spade. And it depends. If you're riding mares, you want to go a little bit lighter. You know, a finer skinned horse, you know, a real thin skinned horse, you might want to go a little lighter. So there's variables in that too, you know. It's like you can tell by the height of a horse if it's going to have a fussy mouth. It's always a real thin-skinned horse, and so you might use a little lighter one on that. What people really don't understand is that the height of the spade, they think that the shorter one is more humane, and it's not. The taller the spade, the duller it is.
Right, because again, going back to the more surface area.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they'll freak out on a 4.5-inch spade, which is real common in old Spade bits. And, you know, when you put that on, at first, if you want to pick up on that bit, once they learn to hold their mouth shut with it, you know, it's like pulling on their tail. If you want to pull on it.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So they have a lot there, but once they learn to signal and find the balance of that, then they get lighter and lighter and lighter through the years.
Gotcha. Fantastic. Okay, so Colton's got a question here. What do you look for when you decide to progress your hackamore horse into the 2 reins so that they can start packing the Spade? And when you first transition, do you do anything particular to help the horse grow comfortable and confident in their new setup?
Well, for me, I want my horse pretty gathered up to where he'll gather easy and hold his collection on his own a little bit. You know, I want him to where I can turn him loose, he can lope and trot, and you know, it's pretty easy. He's not spooking at stuff anymore. He's not bucking or anything like that for sure.
He's no longer farting you off.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I've seen a lot of bridle horses that were bust out, but I don't particularly think that he should.
So would we say those are horses that are wearing a bridle rather than actually being a bridle horse?
Wearing a bridle, rather than bridle horses. Yeah. So, you know, when they're smooth and you feel like they're getting handy. Now, they don't have to be perfect, you know. I think it's one of those things, like for myself, if a horse, most of my horses tend to be a little older when I start them and stuff. So if I get a horse cruising around and he'll go out and I can go gather on him real easy and he doesn't take a lot of two-handedness, and I can, you know, I'll move him with a couple of inches in one hand, ride him one-handed in the hackamore, then I'll start letting him pack that bridle for easy rides. And if it gets fast or starts to get western, I'll just stop and pull my bridle off and use my 2-rein. I think that gives them a lot of time to encourage them. And I can go back, you know, and work on my lead changes and stuff on the hackamore. I don't think there's any big deal in going back and fixing stuff. What I found, what a bridle tells me usually is where my holes are.
Yeah.
You know, I'll go to that, and all of a sudden I can't reach my hand out. You know, the hackamore is pretty flexible. You can do a lot of things with the hackamore. It's the flexible side of the system. When you get to a bridle, you can no longer do those things. And so it'll show you where your holes are. You go back and you fix them up a little bit and try to fill in the gaps, throw some putty on them, and then put your bridle back on and see if it gets better. And so I think, you know, set rules are really, you know, silly in horsemanship because horses change every day.
Yes.
And, you know, we have to be flexible and don't be afraid to go back and fix something up when they're in your hackamore.
Right.
And then go back in. But your bridle will tell you, you know, if you've got to use that thing through that horse's spine and you can't, you know, a lot of people will get the idea that neck rein, and they'll take the V in their reins and they'll push it to where they want to go. Well, that's just creating pressure on the outside rein and tipping that horse the wrong direction.
Right. That's a counterflexion. Mm-hmm.
You know, and so you'll kick them through, but if your horse isn't directed there from his nose to his tail, and, you know, you're just forcing it the wrong direction. So figuring those little things out and understanding, you know, looking at your bit and going, how will it work? How can a horse direct its energy through this piece of metal? You know, if I bind it too much there or there, I'm going to lose a hip or I'm going to drop a shoulder, you know, or the horse is not going to be able, the energy is not going to be able to progress from behind through that piece. And so you can only tip it, you know, it's like 20 degrees each way, really.
Right, right.
And so all that overbending and stuff people do really doesn't help them in the bridle, because then you're down to, I can only use it this much. I can pick up on it, or I can tip it this way or that way. So understand your equipment, know how it works, know how a horse can go through it. What I like is the spade bit. It's so much like like shooting a gun. If you think about your bridle reins, the V in it, like your back sight, and you look down through that bit and that spade, you imagine where that spade is, and that's your front sights. And you line those things up, you're going to be pretty correct through that horse's spine.
Gotcha. Okay.
Your spine behind it. Most people want to shoot, but they want to look off in a different direction. You're not going to go there unless the horse does, so you might as well just stay with it.
Right. Right, for sure. Or hope to, at least, right?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Awesome. Cool. So, am I right in understanding there's now an association for your Californio bridle horse methods process for the folks that are riding and following along with this idea?
Yeah, we actually have I don't know, 300 some members now, and we've been trying to put on an event. We've had it. This will be our 6th year, and it seems to be growing pretty good. Our entry's still in a couple of hours.
Wow!
And everything's based on it's like we don't ride colt still before, or we don't show them. They have to be in a hackamore, 2-rein or bridle. And then also the cattle handling and stuff is all based on it's judged as if the judges own the cattle. And so it's how easily and how humanely things can be handled, how safely, to be efficient, yet everything's a very sustainable system. Speed really doesn't have anything to do with it. It's about how gracefully and smoothly things can be worked. And every aspect of that, we don't have anything in our stock horse, say, that would force you to have to pull on your horses real hard or anything like that. It's all set up from the absolute novice up to the open riders to progress horses. So your hackamore pattern is not the same as your bridle pattern. It's a progression of knowledge and skills for the horses. And, it's been kind of fun to build. It's, and it gives you a chance, like, say, you can show, if you got an 8-year-old in the hackamore, you can still show it. It's what's right for the horse.
Awesome. Okay.
So that's what we're trying to do. And a bunch of people that I was doing workshops with and stuff, we got this idea, to do it at the horse's speed. And then also preserve regatta roping, our open the contenders, all roped with a rawhide regatta, everything slick horn, and everything set up, sloped off a walk trot. And to kind of preserve those, great roping aspect of the California system as well.
Awesome. So what's the name of this organization?
It's the California Bridle Horse Association.
California Bridle Horse Association. Awesome. How can people find out more about that?
Well, they can get on our website, California with an O, bridlehorseassociation.com. And there's quite a bit of information there. We're on Facebook, also the California Bridle Horse Association. And also Early California Skills of the Rancho. And that's our event. And we'll be July 13th, 14th, and 15th at the Cajon Ranch in Lebec, California this year.
Awesome. Awesome. Very cool. All right. Well, I've got some wrap-up questions here that I'm looking forward to hearing your answers for these, if we're ready for those.
Okay.
So, Bruce, if there was one specific thing that you could recommend for riders to focus on as a primary means of improving their horsemanship, what would that be?
The seat. Their seats.
Perfect. Perfect. If you could ride with anyone, past or present, who would it be and why?
That's a tough one. I'd like to ride with Nuno there.
Ah, there you go. That's awesome. That's awesome. I just rode this winter in Portugal. We took an adventure to Portugal and got the chance to ride with Nuno's partner, Senor Luis Valencia. And man, oh man, that was fantastic. And getting the stories of Nuno was amazing. It was amazing stuff.
Yeah, I think he's pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah, really, really cool. Really cool. What is your present personal definition of horsemanship?
Oh, yeah. Present personal definition. I think engagement without tension.
Nice. All right. What book are you currently reading, or was the last book that you read?
The last book, Cattle on 1,000 Hills.
Ah, would you recommend that?
Yeah, it's pretty good. It's a history kind of book, but yeah, it's got some neat stories of early California.
Awesome. I'm writing that one down to add it to my list. That's awesome. All right. Now, how can folks find you and find out more about what you do and where you're teaching?
You can get on my website, which is Bruce Sandifer, CVH.com. And also on Facebook, Bruce Sandifer's California Bridle Horse Workshop.
Perfect. Perfect. All right. So now, another thing that we do here, most of the time when I do a video, and I do lots of live videos answering questions and things like that here through social media, and I tend to have a question of the day that I ask for folks. And it's just a random question, usually one that pops into my head at the last second, so I spurt it out without much thought. And it's a question that I get to ask for everyone in the audience that they get to chime in and answer. So whenever I have a guest on, the guest actually gets to ask the question of the day. So I'm going to pass it to you, and I'm going to ask, what is our question of the day for our audience?
Why do you ride?
That's damn good. You know what? It makes me jealous because every guest that I have that comes on comes up with a better question than what I normally ask. It makes me jealous. I think it's because I ask so many questions, I kind of run out of what I think are great ideas.
Yeah,
but
you asked a bunch of questions. Glad to run out.
No, there we go. There we go. That's great. All right, gang. So why do you ride? I want to know your answers, and I'm going to make sure Bruce checks in too to read your responses. Why do you guys ride? Bruce, thank you so much for joining me for this broadcast. This has been so much fun.
Really enjoyed it, Patrick. Thank you.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much. So hang on there one moment, and I'll get back to you here in just a second. So, gang, I want to thank you so much for tuning in for episode number 28 of Talking About Horses. I really appreciate you giving Bruce and I your ear for this time. Please remember, if you've missed any of it, you'll be able to access the full broadcast through Facebook, YouTube, iTunes, or by streaming it directly from our website by accessing the Talking About Horses page from the Education drop-down menu. Through whatever platform you're listening, please be sure to give us a rating, comment, a review, or a share, hopefully all of those. Your word of mouth and support is the fuel for this fire. Thanks so much, gang. Tune in next time.